You know, I knew a lot of politicians. Not a single one of them ever did that with their wife.
Well, I also realized early on that Mr. Lincoln was going to need my help also with other aspects of furthering his career.
And what was that?
Well, such as convincing him to finally dress more like a statesman than a country stump speaker.
Remember your older sister, Frances. Frances just blurted out once, "Mr. Lincoln's swallowtail coats are always too short, and his patched trousers are shabby, and those socks of his, they often, in color, didn't match."
Well, Mr. Edwards, you needn't have been quite so specific.
Well,
besides, that was said before I married him, and I corrected all of that.
well, you worked at it.
But there was one thing that I was never able to correct, and that was his perpetual informality. What? Mr. Lincoln would answer the front door in rolled-up shirt sleeves, even when he knew that the people we were expecting were going to be important visitors. And then at other times, I would escort our guests into our well-furnished parlor, and there would be Mr. Lincoln stretched out on the floor reading. A habit he had picked up in his log cabin days, and he was loath to give up.
Well, my dear wife said that from time to time, his occasional absent-mindedness frustrated you.
Yes, well, such as the time he took our second-born, little Eddie, out for a walk in the baby wagon. Well, when I saw my husband returning home, my heart almost stopped. He was not aware that that baby wagon he was pulling was empty. Oh, Mr. Lincoln's mind, I guess, was focused on some political or legal conundrum. Well, I rushed right out, found and retrieved our fortunately unharmed baby, who had, totally unbeknownst to his father, simply tumbled right out of that baby wagon.
Little Eddie Edward Baker Lincoln. Let's see, that little one came, what, 2.5 years after Robert?
Yes.
Yes.
And then, well, shortly before Eddie's 4th birthday, he passed over after suffering for 52 days from consumption. Well, about a year later, I gave birth to our 3rd son, Willie. And then in 1853, I birthed our last child, whom we named Robert, whom we named Thomas, pardon me, whom we named Thomas. Well, that little dear was immediately given the nickname of Tad by his father, who joked that our newborn's head looked, well, disproportionately larger than the rest of him, reminded Mr. Lincoln of a tadpole. Well, eventually, our little Tad's body caught up with his head, but that nickname always remained.
Well, you know, your husband always struck me as quite a loving father.
Yes, he was a very loving father. But there was one difficulty in that Mr. Lincoln never disciplined our always rambunctious and often mischievous little boys. Why, when I would attend Sunday church services, well, Mr. Lincoln would take the boys to his office with him, where they would begin pulling books off the bookshelves, knocking over ink bottles, and tossing pencils into the spittoons, while their father sat at his desk, never lifting a finger to stop their uproarious behavior.
Well, you know, he simply struck me, though.
Oh, he was a very loving father.
Yes.
Oh, if that's what you were thinking of, he was a very loving father. Yes. But those boys, they were another matter.
You know, I can attest that they were an absolute handful.
Yes, well, I finally came to the conclusion that somebody had to rein them in, and so I guess that task was going to fall to me, which I took that task. Well, but I myself that my doing that freed up Mr. Lincoln to concentrate on furthering his career.
I'll say, his political career took a nice step forward in 1846 when he got himself elected to the United States House of Representatives.
Oh, yes. And I don't think Mr. Lincoln was any more thrilled than I was, because I felt vindicated in having stubbornly chosen to marry Mr. Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, yes. You know, you raised a few eyebrows in Springfield when she announced that she was going to take her children and accompany him to Washington, D.C. Now, the congressman just didn't do it in that day, especially out in the western states.
But Mr. Lincoln insisted upon it.
Oh, he did.
Although perhaps the fact that I insisted that he insist, that might have helped a little bit.
That explains.
Oh, but it made such good sense. We were partners in his career, and I wanted to be there at his side, joining him in that grand adventure.
Well, your letters home told us that your part of that grand adventure fizzled right away.
Well, I had always imagined our nation's capital to be this grand and glorious place where I would be escorted to glittering social events on the arm of my congressman husband. Well, I quickly learned such events were far beyond our financial means. And on our tight budget, we could only afford to rent another boarding room, just like we had when we were first married. Only this time, I had rambunctious little boys to rein in.
Uh-oh.
No, I confess, I quickly became jealous of Mr. Lincoln's daily activities. What? Just imagine rubbing elbows with the likes of Daniel Webster and, ironically, my former neighbor and friend, Senator Henry Clay. For my husband, a dream had come true. For me, his wife, nothing turned out quite as I had hoped it would.
And it's not like she could just pick up her children and go home to Springfield, because Mr. Lincoln, to make ends meet, rented out their home while he was in Congress. So you had to wait until the next election, which unfortunately he lost, but in some ways fortunately for you, because then you could get back to Springfield. But, oh, even though Mr. Lincoln at that time really concentrated on making good money as a lawyer, it didn't matter. That little motor of political ambition just kept humming in his breast.
And then, after Mr. Lincoln's brilliant debates in 1858 with his U.S. Senate opponent, the same Mr. Stephen A. Douglas that Mr. Edwards had mentioned, well, that newly formed Republican Party were so impressed with Mr. Lincoln's performance, they chose him to be their 1860 nominee for the presidency.
Oh yes, that occurred in May of '60, but then the general election wasn't until, of course, November. That meant he stayed at home. You had him there for the, next 6 months or
Oh,
whatever.
yes, it was so nice. Well, because, of course, no presidential nominee has ever gone out and given even one tiny little speech after being nominated until the election in November.
That's true. It's a fine tradition, that is, I'm sure, still going on. Well, by the way, Mr. Lincoln did get elected. Everyone knows that. But I'm telling you, I think in Springfield, he was the first one to find out, because he stayed in the telegraph office, and he got the word that New York came in for him, Pennsylvania came in. He added up the electoral vote count, and he knew he won the presidency. I'd say the second one was probably you, because they said he ran straight down 8th Street, yelling at the top of his voice, "Mary, Mary, we got ourselves elected."
And then, about, a month before our inauguration, pardon me, before Mr. Lincoln's inauguration, some newspaper correspondents gleaned from some of the people with whom I have been conversing the fact that Mr. Lincoln and I were discussing the merits of his potential cabinet denominations.
Ooh, that's trouble.